Doses of Good Governance. Kaya Natin Movement's webinar series is in partnership with the Philippine Daily Inquirer, the Inquirer Foundation, and Inquirer.net.
Afternoon to all of you. Ayan, hello, welcome and good afternoon to all of you who have joined us today. This is our 8th episode of Doses of Good Governance with the topic Protecting Human Rights in the Context of the COVID-19 Pandemic. Magandang hapon po sa ating lahat. I am your moderator, Jeng Reyes, a former Mayor of Alicia, Isabela. This activity is in line with the celebration of Kaya Natin movement for good governance and ethical leadership, its 12th anniversary. Kaya Natin has been founded on the ideals of promoting good governance and ethical leadership in the country. 12 years after, we are still driven by the same passion we had before. To commemorate the 12 years of the organization, Doses of Good Governance webinar series was born. Through this program, we aim to educate our fellow Filipinos on the wide range of topics covering the theme of good governance while at home. We would like to thank our partners today, the Philippine Daily Inquirer, the Inquirer Foundation, Inquirer.net, and Inquirer Mobile for this webinar series. The webinar will also be played live on Kaya Natin's official Facebook page. So welcome, and we are very honored to have all of you today. And we are very excited to hear our speakers who are experts in this issue. Andito po sila, yung ating mga speakers. I'd like to recognize them. We have Atty. Chel Diokno. Good afternoon, Dean Chel. Andito po si Carlo. And later, Congressman Teddy Baguilat will be joining us also. So, but before we proceed, some reminders first. Please observe these rules during the webinar. For those who are in the Zoom room, please mute your audio unless you are asked to. You're encouraged to raise questions or comments later during the open forum. Please use the chat box for this purpose, or for those who are watching live on Facebook, you may use the comment box. For today's topic, protecting human rights in the context of COVID-19 pandemic, our points for discussion are arrest on dissenters, quarantine violators, how to protect human rights, report abuse, fair labor practices, press freedom. Later on, we will be able to ask some controversial questions. These incidents that happened during the pandemic, such as many complaints on human rights, many complaints with the Human Rights Commission, such as degrading treatment on quarantine violators, like corporal punishments, some were handcuffed, beaten by barangay officials, and even shot by the police, such as in the case of former soldier Winston Ragos. Some were also detained when they held rallies, assembled or gathered, like the jeepney drivers who demanded Balik Pasada, and students who protested about the anti-terror bill, closure of ABS-CBN during the pandemic, red tagging of dissenters or just by mere stating an opinion against the government. We really have an interesting and controversial topic this afternoon. Each speaker will be given 15 minutes to discuss and present. As soon as we finish with our 3 speakers, then we will have 50 minutes to entertain questions and answers. Okay, are we ready? So to call on our first speaker, is the 6th District Representative of Quezon City, who prides himself as being a consummate public servant, having spent most of his life as a public interest lawyer, a community organizer, an NGO worker. His passion for service was recognized early as he finished his Bachelor of Laws with distinction of Outstanding Legal Aid Intern. While in law school, he became part of the legislative staff of then 4th District Representative Feliciano Belmonte Jr. Passing the bar marked the beginning of his relentless desire to share his legal knowledge to those in need, providing training to community paralegals and free legal clinics. Our guest served as paralegal program officer for empowering civic participation and governance before co-founding the Belmonte Season Sawali and Associates. Concurrently, he offered his services as consultant for the Center for Empowering Communities. Before entering politics, he became a consultant for the Liga ng mga Barangay ng Quezon City and administrator of the historical Baguilat area under the office of the mayor. Soon after, he was chosen as a consultant for the office of the Presidential Advisor on Political Affairs under the office of the President before fulfilling his mandate to represent the 6th District of Quezon City in the House of Representatives. Our guest, Congressman Jose Christopher Kit Belmonte. He is ably represented by his Chief Legal Officer and Communications Head of the Office of Congressman Kit. Our representative, or his representative, has earned his Bachelor of Science major in Social Anthropology and Master of Community Development in the University of the Philippines. He worked with various organizations in peace building and human rights advocacy. We are privileged to have Mr. Lian Carlo Luis Ipac. Welcome, Carlo.
Thank you po, Ma'am Jeng. Thank you po. First off, apologies dun sa hindi pagpunta ni Kong Kit kasi meron po siyang mga urgent matters sa district. And nakasabay noon ay may urgent matters din sa house. So pinagsasabay niya yung meeting via Zoom. Sige. So let me start with our presentation. Share screen. Okay. Mm-hmm. Bakit hindi ako nakakapag-share screen? Ano nakakaano? Oh.
Meron na.
Meron na. Hindi ko siya nakita sa akin. Sandali lang po. Ayun. Okay, so this is our presentation, Protecting Human Rights in the Context of the Pandemic. Mas we're focused on how we responded to the pandemic for the past 6 months. Pero ang magiging form kasi ng aming presentation is nag-case study kami ng isang community na talagang mabigat ang tama ng COVID-19 within our district. So this is our outline of the presentation. First, we will discuss kung paano yung naging community quarantine and how we responded in the district. And then yung experience sa ground, yung experiences namin sa ground. So we will cover the case study of Sitio Kaingin Bukid in Barangay Apolonio, Samson. And then third is yung violations on paano how we responded din sa community quarantine violators in the district. And then lastly, siguro yung mga lessons na nakuha namin for the past 6 months. So first, yung community quarantine nung start niya nung March ay curtailed talaga yung right natin for freedom of right to public assembly and yung freedom of movement natin. Ideally yun lang. Sana yung kailangan na i-limit nung community quarantine. But as the months went on, nabalitaan natin na may mga iba pang rights na nalabag noong mga nakalipas na buwan. Pero, but how did we cope? How did we manage the pandemic anchored on the principles of human rights? So, una, ang pinaka-importante kasi naming nakita talaga doon is we gave a multi-sectoral approach to COVID-19. So we coordinated with the health sector, led by our district health office, the barangay councils, yung mga barangay captains namin, and yung law enforcement. And ni-specify namin yung mga kanya-kanyang tasks nila para kahit papano meron tayong accountable sila and open yung lines of communications. So, essentially, we exerted our leadership sa district, even though it is outside our mandate na mag-respond sa COVID Essentially, di ba? Ideally, kasi we're legislators Pero, syempre, in our passion for public service, talagang we went over and beyond our duties and we led the district for the past few months in this COVID response. So how did we do it? First, we coordinated our efforts with the barangay health sector and law enforcement. So kami yung parang nagsisilbing secretariat ng mga stakeholders in the district kung paano mag-respond sa COVID-19. Next is we established systems of communication among stakeholders. So mga contact tracers, volunteers, private sector, we bridge them together para mas smooth yung efforts and yung strategies natin. We provided material and technical support to all stakeholders. Ito yung mas key kung paano kami pumapasok dun sa response natin kasi bukod sa we can there may politika syempre, may indebtedness, we provided na-influence din namin yung kanilang strategy on how to respond to the pandemic. And then yung mga strategies we influence din yung kanila kung paano sila kung ano yung mga activities dapat nila in line with human rights principles. So this is the case study that I was talking about earlier. Ito yung case of Sitio Kaingin Bukid, wherein I think 1,000 families live there. And kaya siya nag-declare siya ng complete hard lockdown. We call it a special concern lockdown in Quezon City dahil may nakita na kaming 39 cases in that 2,000 square meter na land area where 1,000 families live. So siksikan, dense, and then medyo poor din yung hygiene conditions niya kasi it's beside the river siya, tas maraming informal settlements. The lockdown lasted for 29 days and during the lockdown, binagyo pa noon at since flood-prone area siya, umaabot yung baha noon ng mga, I think, chest area. So we had to, during a lockdown na may maraming cases ng COVID-19, we had to evacuate the people there. So it was a logistical nightmare. And then before the lockdown was lifted, a riot ensued in the area kasi sobrang frustrated na yung mga tao kasi isang buwan na silang hindi nakakalabas ng kanilang mga bahay. And so mayroon kahit paano, may mga concerted efforts. Yung LGU, District Health Office, and barangay officials and law enforcers in keeping the lockdown, in pag-implement ng community, nung hard lockdown, while providing for the basic needs of the families there. So what did we do? Una is, nagkaroon kami, nag-mass testing kami sa community. As in, I think 2,500 people were tested free ng swab testing for that duration nung months, nung isang buwan na yon. And then nagkaroon din ng efficient provision of food and other relief na mas sinorse namin siya talaga sa private sector and sa government. So we tapped doon sa mga iba't ibang mga partners namin sa district para makapag-donate sila kasi medyo malaking tao to eh. And then may mga may mga conflict pa rin talaga sa loob lalo na since nakakulong yung mga tao. We facilitated the negotiations in times of these conflicts. And then since since takot din yung mga tao sa mga pulis noon, what we opted is maging community-led yung kanilang pagbabantay and in keeping the peace within the community is we mobilize community volunteers in the area para kahit paano may ownership sila doon sa kanilang may ownership and leadership sila doon sa response nila to the lockdown. And then syempre hindi mo may iwasan na may medical emergencies pa din doon sa sa area is nag-establish din kami ng temporary clinic wherein mayroong mga first aid and nagsagawa pa ng minor operation during the time of the lockdown. So nahirapan kami noon kasi yun nga, I think mas naging familiar dito earlier in the pandemic na mahatagal yung swab test results. It took a week or more to get your results. Kaya ideally kasi yung lockdown 14 days lang dapat siya pero humaba siya ng 29 days. Kasi ang tagal ng results. So hindi namin mapalabas yung mga tao kasi hindi namin alam kung COVID positive sila or hindi. And then meron ng existing conflict in the community na lalo pang na-exacerbate ng lockdown. Kasi yung community is is headed for malaki siyang housing project. So may mainit na din yung usapin ng pabahay doon. And may ng division among the people there. So nung nagka-lockdown pa, lalong nag-exacerbate yung divisions within the community. Kaya umabot siya sa hantong na talagang nagka-riot na. And then people had difficulty adapting and were anxious of the stringency and consequences of the lockdown. Nandun na rin kasi yung takot nila na mawawalan sila ng trabaho habang naka-lockdown or hindi sila kumikita habang naka-lockdown kasi kung arawan ang inyong sahod, hindi mo naman hindi ka kakasahod kasi naka-lockdown ka nga. And so ayan. So ang doon is yung hard lockdown ba it worked? Did yung pagputol ba yung pag-restrict ba ng freedom nila of movement and pag-curtail nila for public assembly, did it work? I don't want this to be a precedent kasi malaking issue pa rin siya Yun yung tanong namin din dito na where do we draw the line? But apparently it did. Kasi if you would look at this, itong June 11 nagsimula yung special concern lockdown. Towards the half of it, yung cases in the barangay were falling. And then it nag-drop talaga siya yung active cases, yung yellow line kasi medyo natakot din yung mga tao na maano sila ng lockdown. But it came with a lot of costs na although it worked nakita namin to sa data namin, it's the most effective way to control the spread of the pandemic. It came with a lot of costs. It came with a lot of costs lalo sa mga tao na nahirapan talaga na may mga nawalan din ng trabaho. But we didn't have a choice kasi nakita ng city government nakita ng district health officer namin na yung 39 detected cases na dun sa community ay close contact silang lahat. So ibig sabihin, may community transmission na at kalat na yung COVID-19 doon sa buong community na yon. Yun yung medyo medyo nakakatakot siya. So, ito naman is, yung isang part din is, where do we draw the line ba? Pag nagva-violate tayo ng community quarantine protocols. This is one of what we did. Parang, we provided technical support and sa Philippine National Police sa district namin. And we came up with a module na kung paano ba natin tuturuan yung mga tao doon sa pag-prevent ng pagkalat ng COVID-19. Kasi pag may mga nahuhuli sila, dati noon talaga ay dinadala pa sa presinto. Pero ang sabi namin, sir, napupuno na yung mga presinto nyo. So kayo rin nagva-violate ng community quarantine protocols kasi pinagtitipon-tipon natin yung mga tao. Why not educate natin yung mga tao, gawin natin silang active agents din para sila din yung mismong para mas informed na rin sila kung paano maiwasan yung pandemic to. Kasi apparently and sadly, madami pa rin hindi nakakaalam kung paano kumakalat or kahalagahan ng pagsuot ng mask sa mga communities. Much worse, yung iba hindi naniniwala na may pandemic. Yes, we have Karens. We have some Karens here in the Philippines, but they do exist kasi ganun sila ka-skeptical, lalo-lalo na sa government. Na mababa yung trust nila pagdating sa government. But ang namin dito is, in applying governance anchored in human rights during pandemic, we came from a position of power kasi. So may ganun kayong privilege. And it's fortunate na we can exert our influence on stakeholders, lalong-lalo na sa pagbibigay namin ng technical support sa kanila. And then, kailangan mo talaga mag-develop ng favorable relations with these stakeholders, with the district health, with your barangays, and especially with the law enforcement, para kahit paano meron kayong nakikita nila yung mutual benefit, yung pagkakaroon ng governance anchored on human rights. And some of our lessons here is COVID-19 is not an equalizer talaga. Hindi totoo yung sinasabi ng mga tao na lahat tayo pantay-pantay sa COVID-19. Yes, lahat tayo pwede maapektuhan, mayaman or mahirap. Pero iba ang epekto ng COVID-19 sa mayaman at sa mahirap. Dahil ang mga mahirap, mas at risk sila na i-lockdown at ma-curtail yung kanilang rights kaysa sa mga mayayaman. Pero ang bottom line kasi talaga dito is we have to kailangan balik-balikan natin yung principle na talagang virus yung kalaban natin, hindi yung isa't isa. So, ayun. So that's it. Yun po yung presentation ko. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you very much, Carlo. Ayan, kayo mismo talagang on the ground. Dahil incumbent official si Kongkit at kayo ay kayong pinadadala, dinedeploy, no? Yes. Kabisado ninyo kung ano nangyayari. So yan, kitang-kita nila Carlo at nila Kongkit kung paano. Mabuti na lang, gaya ng sinabi mo, you exerted your influence doon sa inyong district at natutukan ninyo at nasubaybayan ninyo, lalo na influence the response in line with human rights, di ba? So napakita. So later on, we will have questions for you, Carlo. Okay.
Sure.
So for our second speaker, our next speaker is the founding dean of the De La Salle University College of Law and the chair of the Free Legal Assistance Group, FLAG. He has been practicing law for 30 years and gained prominence as a human rights lawyer and litigator. The DLSU College of Law, which opened in 2010, is the first law school in the Philippines to highlight human rights and legal aid as part of its educational program. While the Free Legal Assistance Group, or FLAG, is the oldest organization of human rights lawyers in the Philippines, known for handling cases involving civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. Though already well known in legal and human rights circles, he gained wider public prominence when he ran on a platform of justice and judicial reform during the 2019 senatorial elections. He emerged as one of the leading opposition senatorial candidates, largely because of his connection with young voters, who made sure he consistently topped nearly all pre-election polls and surveys in schools and universities all over the country. Though he actually has no grandchildren yet, these young Filipinos adopted our speaker as their woke lolo during the campaign because of his progressive stance on issues, his advocacy for youth empowerment, and his witty remarks despite the occasional dad jokes. Even with the elections, he continues to engage his children by serving as speaker for various events for numerous schools and organizations all over the country, with speaking engagements serving as a venue for continuing his advocacy for justice, human rights, and empowering the youth. Ladies and gentlemen, Attorney Jose Manuel Chel Diokno.
Maraming salamat, Mayor Jeng, at magandang hapon sa ating lahat. Before I start, I'd like to thank Kaya Natin, Philippine Daily Inquirer, Inquirer Foundation, and Inquirer.net for hosting this very good forum on human rights. Dapat talaga pag-usapan natin itong issue ng karapatang pantao. Dahil sa akin ay napakahalaga ang human rights para sa ating bayan. Before I start, I also want to do a shout out sa lahat ng mga frontliners natin. We will never be able to thank you as much as we should. I'd like to thank all of the health workers, all of those who are out on the streets helping us, our security personnel, lahat ng mga nasa ating mga supermarkets at groceries at pati sa mga palengke. At I want to thank as well all our teachers for going out of their way to continue the education of our students. At syempre, shout out din sa lahat ng mga estudyante. Naku, mahal na mahal ko kayo. You are like my children. I also want to shout out to our human rights defenders. Sila yung mga hindi gaanong kinikilala ng ating lipunan. Sila rin yung ngayon ay parang minsan nare-red tag at kung ano-ano pa ang nangyayari sa kanila. Our human rights defenders are also frontliners of a different sort kasi sila yung nasa frontline pagdating sa ating dignidad. Our human rights defenders are actually fighting for our humanity. They are fighting for our dignity. They are fighting for our diversity and our inclusiveness. Kasi kung tutuusin naman, we all belong to one human family. At yung karapatang pantao, yung konsepto ng human rights, yan ang nagpapatibay doon sa sinasabi natin na tayo ay isang pamilya lang. Maraming mga fake news na kinakalat ngayon tungkol sa karapatang pantao. Marami silang sinasabi na hindi maganda tungkol sa amin mga human rights defenders. But I would just want to address that with one word, empowerment. Pag kaming mga human rights defenders at lahat kayo na tumayo para sa karapatang pantao ay nanindigan para sa human rights, actually, what we are doing is we are standing up for empowerment. Kasi kung tutuusin, sino ba yung nangangailangan ng kapangyarihan ngayon? Hindi naman yung mga nasa pwesto. Hawak-hawak na nila yung napakalaking powers na. Ang talagang nangangailangan ng empowerment ngayon ay yung mga nasa laylayan ng ating lipunan. And kaya nga tayo may batas at kaya nga tayo mayroong karapatang pantao ay para sa kanila. Kung tutuusin, yung mga malalaking tao, hindi naman nila kailangan ng human rights. Makita lang yung magandang kotse nila at yung mga kasama nilang mga bodyguard ay gagalang na sila. Pero yung talagang nangailangan ng ating hindi lang tulong, kundi na ating suporta at lalong-lalo na ang nangailangan ng empowerment sa ating bayan ay yung mga mahihirap, yung mga nangailangan, yung mga nagugutom ngayon na nasa ilalim tayo ng pandemya. Human rights is really just all about people standing up for each other. Ako mismo, I have been a human rights defender, a human rights lawyer for more than 30 years. At sa mga nahawakan kong mga kaso, sa mga natulungan kong mga kliyente, nakita ko talaga na sa ating bayan, ang hustisya ay parang doble kara. Parang meron tayong double standard pagdating sa justice. Kung ikaw ay yung sinasabing maliit na tao, kung ikaw ay yung sinasabing nasa laylayan ng ating lipunan, ay hindi ka makakaasa ng katarungan pagka ikaw ay naging biktima ng human rights violation o ng pang-aabuso ng mga malalaking tao. Samantalang kung mga malalaking tao naman yung naging biktima ay agad-agad sila ay nakakakuha ng hustisya. Kaya ako mismo sa tingin ko I am very determined to continue fighting for human rights because when I fight for human rights, I'm not fighting for myself. I'm fighting for the marginalized, the voiceless, those who deserve more in life because they really have dedicated their lives not just for themselves but for helping their families. Kung titingnan natin yung nangyari sa ilalim ng pandemya, nung nagsimula yung lockdown, akala ko gaganda pa yung sitwasyon ng human rights. Pero nakakalungkot man sabihin, ay meron tayong mga karapatan na para pang ay lalo pang nailabag dito sa COVID-19 na oras. In terms of our right to dignity, for example, which includes our right to liberty and our freedom of speech, I think nakita nyo naman yung mga sunod-sunod na mga pang-aaresto nila. Ang bilang mismo ng Philippine National Police ay lumampas na sa 100,000 na katao ang kanilang hinuli. Hindi dahil sa nagsagawa sila ng mga krimen, yung mga masasamang mga gawain, kundi dahil sila ay naglabag umano ng quarantine rules. At maliban pa doon, nakita rin natin yung mga pang-aaresto ng mga netizen na wala naman ginawang masama. Ang ginawa lang naman nila ay nag-post sa Facebook o sa Twitter ng kanilang mga saloobin at kanilang mga hinaing. And yet, pinuntahan sila sa bahay, kinatok, kinuli na walang warrant at sinampahan ng mga kaso. Mabuti naman, yung sa mga nahawakan namin mismo na mga kaso nila, ay pagdating sa korte, mismo ang judge ang nagsabi na walang kwenta pala yung pagsampa ng kaso sa kanila at pati yung pang-aresto sa kanila. May isa kaming kliyente, si Teacher Ronel, nag-post lang sa Facebook, ayun, nahuli na. Pero nung umabot sa court yung kanyang kaso, yung mismong judge na ang nagsabi at yung mismong judge ang nagbasura ng kaso. Ganon din yung isa namin natulungan na isang writer sa Cebu, si Miss Beltran, na nahuli din dahil meron lang siyang pinost sa Facebook. Pero pagdating sa korte ay sabi mismo ng judge ay wala namang kwenta itong kasong ito. Ang makikita natin na leksyon dito, palagay ko, yung matututunan natin dito sa mga nangyayari sa pandemya ay, number one, we have to stand up for our rights. At kahit hindi yung mismong karapatan natin ang nalabag, kahit sa ibang tao ang naging biktima ng human rights violation, ay dapat manindigan din tayo para sa kanila. At doon sa mga nangyari nga ng mga kaso ay nagtagumpay naman ang mga human rights defender, nagtagumpay yung mga naging biktima ng human rights violations. Yung isa rin na medyo nakakabahala ngayon, yung nangyayari sa ating right to education. Alam ko yung mga nanonood na estudyante ngayon, palagay ko marami rin kayong mga tanong mamaya tungkol sa nangyayari ngayon, yung online learning, yung mga modular learning, at yung nakita natin na parang may malaking pagkukulang sa pagpaplano ang ating pamahalaan pagdating sa edukasyon sa ilalim ng pandemya. I hope that we can have a deeper discussion of this later. Ang susunod na tanong ay paano naman natin mapoprotektahan ang karapatang pantao? What can we do as caring people, as people who have a regard for the dignity of everyone? Kasi kung tutuusin, yan naman ang human rights. Kaya natin kinikilala ang karapatang pantao ay para kahit sino ka pa, kahit ikaw yung pinakamahirap na Pilipino, walang boses, walang ari-arian, ay may dignidad ka pa rin at ang trato dapat sa inyo ay bilang tao at hindi hayop. Yun talaga yung pinaka-kahalagahan ng karapatang pantao. So how do we protect human rights? Well, I think the pandemic has taught us how to do it also. Unang-una, kailangan magpo-push back tayo. Kung meron naging biktima ng human rights, hangga't maaari ay tulungan natin, suportahan natin. At kung sa tingin niya ay talagang kailangan niya ng hustisya at siya ay magsasampa ng kaso, ay suportahin din natin yung paghahabol niya ng katarungan para sa kanya. Second, if it reaches a situation where it's a serious human rights violation at medyo delikado o kaya nakakatakot na magsampa ng kaso, at the minimum dapat ay ma-document natin ng kumpleto yung pangyayari. So if there are very serious human rights violations, halimbawa yung mga nangyayari, hanggang ngayon nangyayari pa rin ng mga EJK sa ngalan ng war on drugs, ay kailangan madokumento natin ng buo yan. At dyan makakakuha tayo ng tulong sa Commission on Human Rights at sa mga grupong tulad ng Free Legal Assistance Group at ibang mga lawyers, NGOs na talagang tumutulong sa mga biktima ng human rights violations. Pangatlo ay dapat i-report natin. I-report natin sa CHR, i-report natin sa iba't ibang mga ahensya ng ating pamahalaan, ombudsman, at kahit sa PNP o sa AFP, at pati na rin sa United Nations. Dahil alam nyo, marami sa UN na talagang gustong tumulong sa atin pagdating sa issue ng human rights. Lalapitan lang natin at they will do what they can to help us. Never ako nawawalan ng pag-asa kahit na minsan ay yung mga nakikita ko at natutulungan ko mga kliyenteng biktima ng human rights ay talagang hirap na. When I look at their situation from a higher picture, nakikita ko na this is just a little bump in the road. We will overcome the issues about human rights that we are facing today. Alam ko, lalong-lalo na sa mga kabataan ngayon, marami sa inyo ay talagang minsan nagagalit na, na-frustrate, hindi nyo lang malaman kung anong gagawin. Sometimes I get in my conversations with you, parang meron kayong sense of hopelessness or powerlessness. Ako na mismo sasabihin ko sa iyo, huwag tayong mawala ng pag-asa. Dahil kung titingnan naman natin yung ating kasaysayan, ay lumalaban tayo hanggang tayo ay magtatagumpay. There is no cause that is greater than human rights. There is no cause that we should really value and fight for that can really help our country than human rights. Kaya sa akin, this is something that all of us should dedicate ourselves to and do everything we can to change the present situation. I know it will happen. I can sense that there's already a growing feeling among many of us that will make change happen. Kaya ako rin ay optimistic na this change is going to happen and it will happen sooner than we all expect. So yun lang naman yung aking konting pakikipag-usap sa inyo tungkol sa karapatang pantao. I just want to leave you with one last thought. Alam nyo, nung hindi pa tayo napanganak, nung mga 15th century hanggang sa mga 18th century, ang slavery ay tanggap ng buong mundo. Nung panahon na yon, yung buong ekonomiya ng yung world economy natin ay nakabase sa slavery. Ibig sabihin, ang tao noon ay property lang. Wala siyang dignidad, wala siyang sariling karapatan, pwedeng ibenta, pwedeng bumili ng tao. And yet, within the span of one generation, we were able to abolish slavery because a few good people decided na hindi tama yan at kailangan palitan natin itong napaka masamang practice na nangyayari sa ating mundo. So change can always happen. All it takes is a few dedicated, committed people to change the world. Maraming salamat po at magandang hapon.
Thank you very much, Attorney Chel. Ayan, ang galing po, very simple yung pagka-explain ninyo. At nakakita ko ng pag-asa. Sana, very hopeful po. Opo. So nakita natin, I'm sure ang dami pong tanong sa inyo kasi ako mismo may tanong kung yung pwede kayong mag-file ng case against sa mga who did illegal arrests, di ba? Pwede bang balikan yung mga yun? Mga ganun ba na okay, nakalabas na nga pero naparusahan ba yung maling pagka-aresto? Yung mga ganyang tanong, sir. Opo. So, mamaya, excited akong itanong sa inyo yun. Pero yan, andito na po yung ating ikatlong speaker. I-introduce ko na po siya. Para po sa ating ikatlong speaker, ang ating last speaker, he belongs to the Tuwali tribe of Ifugao and the Gandang tribe of Nueva Vizcaya provinces in northern Luzon. He has been mayor of Kiangan in 1995 to 2000 and governor of Ifugao in 2001 to 2004, 2007 and to 2010. Since 2010, he has been congressman for the Lone District of Ifugao, championing the cause of all indigenous peoples in the Philippines. From 2010 to 2013, he was chairman of the Philippine Congress Committee on National Cultural Communities, and from 2013 to 2016, vice chairperson of the Committee on Indigenous Peoples. Within the House of Representatives of the Philippines, our speaker has consistently voted for liberal ideals, like being against the reimposition of the death penalty, to curb police brutalities, and to stop the discrimination of marginalized sectors, and including indigenous peoples. As a key supporter of human rights, he has promoted free public college and university education, legalized divorce, free Wi-Fi access in all public places, mental health education, maternity leave rights, LGBT rights, indigenous education in all indigenous communities, and other many bills focusing on indigenous issues. Ladies and gentlemen, we have the privilege to present our last speaker, Honorable Teodoro Teddy Baguilat. Welcome, former Congressman Teddy Baguilat.
Thank you very much. Magandang hapon po. Thank you. Salamat, Mayor Jeng. At kay Attorney Chel at sa mga participants natin dito sa ating Kaya Natin Doses of Good Governance. No? I'm sure sina Kong Kit at saka sina Attorney Chel, marami na silang naikwento tungkol sa kalagayan ng ating bansa. No? Maliban sa binanggit ni Jeng kanina na ako ay dating kongresista at sa ngayon ako ay nagkatrabaho sa Liberal Party. But my presence here, I carry my APHR hat or yung ASEAN Parliamentarians for Human Rights kasi ako yung kasalukuyang Executive Director ng ASEAN Parliamentarians for Human Rights. No? So kami ay isang organization ng mga kongresista at mga senator sa buong Southeast Asia, kasama yung mga parliamentarians natin dito sa Pilipinas, who promote and advocate human rights in the region, in and outside of the parliament. Kaya ang ikakwento ko ngayon ay medyo regional context, no, yung kalagayan ng Southeast Asia, para man malaman natin na yung nararamdaman natin, na nararanasan natin na pagkitil ng ating karapatang pantao ay hindi lang dito sa Pilipinas, but it is a trend all over the world, particularly in our region. No? Yung merong isang attend ako na webinar about freedom of religion or belief at present ng isang speaker yung Democracy and Human Rights Index in Southeast Asia. Kung ano yung kalagayan ng mga countries in Southeast Asia. At merong 4 na bansa andun sa red zone, na red tag sila, no? Ibig sabihin sila yung bansa na talagang walang political freedoms. No? I'm talking about Laos, Vietnam. No? So siguro appropriately called red tag because these are communist states, no, one-party states. And then you have Cambodia. Dahil sa Cambodia, it's a republic pero practically banned ang political opposition. Their opposition is either in exile or in jail. And then you have Myanmar. Kasi sa Myanmar, even if it's transitioning towards democracy, no, andyan si Aung Suu Kyi, but decoration lang siya because the real power resides in the military. No, yung police, yung militar, they don't report to Aung Suu Kyi, but they report to the generals. No? And then nasa yellow zone ng Pilipinas. No? May democracy, may human rights, pero under threat. No? In fact, there's shrinking democratic space in the Philippines. Kasama natin ang Thailand. Because from Thailand, from a military junta, nag-transition sila into a republic. No? They just had their elections. They just had a new constitution. But there's still a lot of repression in Thailand. In fact, no, if we would like to get some inspiration from the entire region, let's look towards Thailand because doon ang lakas ng protest movements, no? Particularly led by the young, no? By the students, no? And their protest in Thailand is not so much about the pandemic response because maganda naman ang kalagayan, no, ng COVID-19 sa Thailand. But despite the good figures that they have, there's less cases in Thailand, medyo under control na yung pandemic. It is still under emergency rule, no? So ang inalaban ng mga estudyante doon is against the Prime Minister, si Prime Minister Prayuth, no, who was the former general that led a coup d'etat, no, and led the military junta, and their king. No? So kung sa Pilipinas ang presidente ay Tatay Digong, doon naman sa Thailand ang hari ay Diyos. But now the students are leading mass protests, no, against the Prime Minister. They want him to resign. They want to have more democracy and freedoms and also to have reforms in the powers of the royalty. Kasi dun sa Thailand, ang hari, no, hindi lang siya Diyos sa kanilang kultura pero sa kanilang saligang batas. No? Sa kanilang batas, no, it's bawal magsalita laban sa hari kundi makukulong ka. So that's a situation in Thailand. And then sa Malaysia, ganun rin. No? Akala namin when the new government, no, unseated the very corrupt, no, and tyrannical Prime Minister Najib of Malaysia in 2018, no, we would have anticipated that Malaysia would be the new model of democracy and liberalism in Southeast Asia, no, kasi nagsanib puwersa si dating Prime Minister Mahathir at saka yung political opposition, no, led by Anwar Ibrahim, at napatanggal nila, no, yung Prime Minister whose party has ruled or had ruled Malaysia for 2 decades. No? Ang tagal na yung party na yon, no? Pero nagalit ang taong bayan dahil sa kahirapan, dahil sa corruption, at napanalo nila, no, yung coalition ni Mahathir at saka ni Ibrahim. Unfortunately, Mahathir renege on a lot of his promises, no, doon sa kanyang mga kaalyado, no? And one of this is yung term sharing, kasi sabi niya na darating yung panahon na ipapamahala na niya kay Anwar Ibrahim, no, yung leadership of the government, pero hindi nangyari. So kung meron tayong problema ng term sharing sa Congress, ganun rin ang nangyari sa Malaysia. So right now, ang balak ng current Prime Minister, because natanggal nga, nanalo si Mahathir pero nagkaroon ng gulo, no? Hindi niya sinunod yung kanyang mga promises to repeal certain anti-human rights legislation of Malaysia, and therefore nagkaroon na naman ng change of government, no? Natanggal si Mahathir, pero ang naipasok na ang naging prime minister ay yung dating tinanggal nila, no? So parang kunyari, let's say si Marcos natanggal, may pumalit, pero nag-away-away ulit yung mga pumalit. So nagkaroon na naman ng gulo, ang pumalit o bumalik ay si Marcos. So ganun rin ang nangyari sa Malaysia, no? But now, ang balak ng Prime Minister is to declare an emergency rule in Malaysia using the pandemic as an excuse, no? Pero hindi siya tinanggap ng ng hari, because in Malaysia there's also a king. Okay? So that's the situation overall sa Southeast Asia. And when the pandemic happened, this only caused a regression in an already deteriorating human rights and democratic situation across Southeast Asia. Mas lalong lumala, no? And I will give you some examples, no? Particularly in the passage of emergency measures, no? Like, so in Thailand and the Philippines and Cambodia, meron tayong mga emergency measures purposely to respond to the pandemic problem, no? But are actually limiting or curtailing our freedoms of our human rights, no? For example, sa Philippines, no, nabanggit na siguro to ni Kongkit, no, yung Bayanihan to Heal as One Act, which opens the possibility to Section 6, the possibility for individuals to be jailed for spreading false information about COVID-19. It's also similar in Thailand, no? They have this Emergency Decree 2005 and this new emergency regulation, Section 6, which allows the Prime Minister, si Prime Minister Prayuth, to censor publications on a broad range of vague reasons. Mas grabe sa Cambodia, no? The law grants authorities to monitor, observe, and collect information from all telecommunications and ban information that could scare the public, no? Kaya sa Indonesia, sa Cambodia, meron mga kinulong dahil nag-post lang sila sa social media accounts nila about, no, what was happening in Cambodia, no? Yung inefficient contact tracing ng government. So pinost lang nila, no? Yung worsening pandemic situation in Cambodia, pinost lang nila sa Facebook, kinulong sila, no? In Thailand, several emergency decrees have also been introduced this year, no? There's a decree purposely aimed at addressing the pandemic, which remains in force and has been repeatedly renewed despite the number of new COVID cases kept to a minimum. No? Kasi sa Thailand, bumababa na, no, yung number of COVID cases. Since the introduction of this law, the law has been used to restrict the right to peaceful assembly and expression. Rights organization Thai Lawyers for Human Rights has documented at least 21 cases involving 73 persons allegedly involved in political rallies. So, pinagbawal ang rally sa Thailand. But obviously, it's not working. No, meron din isang emergency decree, no, sa Thailand which ban gatherings of more than 4 persons and prohibits the publication of news and information that could instigate fear or threaten national security. And while this has been rescinded, the law was quickly invoked to arrest peaceful protesters. So in Thailand, maraming mga kinukulong, pero tuloy pa rin yung kanilang mga kilos protesta. Tulad rin sa Pilipinas, di ba? I think we have the longest lockdown, sabi nga nila. And also the lockdown has, no, led to more than 30,000 people being arrested. No? Yung ating Bayanihan Law, no? Although I think Bayanihan Law has already expired, yung Bayanihan Law 1, but there's another Bayanihan Law. The law has been used against journalists for allegedly spreading disinformation related to the pandemic. No? Merong dalawang, as an example, no, may dalawang reporters, no, sa Cavite, no, si Mario Batwigas at saka si Amor Virata, na sila ay kinasuhan, no, because they only reported and opposed by the mayor na nagasabi na may mga pasyente, coronavirus patients sa isang hospital sa Cavite City. So ang sabi ng government, that's disinformation, no? That's false news. Because of the Bayanihan Law Act, that's why kinasuhan nila yung mayor at kinasuhan rin yung dalawang reporters, no? In Malaysia, the cabinet recently attempted to introduce a state of emergency on the grounds of combating COVID-19. No? Yun nga, nakwento ko kanina, sinubukan ng Prime Minister na mag-declare ng state of emergency, no? Ginagamit ang COVID-19. However, hindi nangyari ito because hindi siya tinanggap ng hari. Because in Malaysia, meron silang hari. No? The king is chosen among the 9 sultans of Malaysia. No, while he doesn't have any political power, pero napakahalaga rin trabaho niya kasi siya yung nag-accept, no, ng legislation. No, tulad ng pagpasasana ng Emergency Power Act o nag-accept ng appointment of the Prime Minister. No? Similarly, like in the United Kingdom, no, where the Queen Elizabeth accepts, no, whoever is elected among the Labour or the Conservative Party. No? COVID also provided authorities the opportunity to use other laws. For instance, the fake news laws, and the means to clamp down on the critics. As an example, sa Malaysia, the South China Morning Post journalist Tashni Sukumaran was questioned by the police for reporting on the raids and arrests of hundreds of migrant workers and refugees as part of the government efforts to tackle the pandemic. Sa Myanmar naman, no, the Ministry of Communication and Transport blocked more than 200 websites which they claimed spread fake news under a law that allows the government to suspend the use of telecommunication services for the benefit of the people. At may karumal-dumal, no, na pangyayari sa Myanmar, no, authorities used COVID-19 response measures as a pretext to harass and extort ethnic Rohingyan people. No? Ito yung mga Muslim. Muslim minority in Myanmar. Grabe talaga. No? They are being killed. No? They're being raped. There's genocide against the Rohingyan people just because they are Muslims. They don't belong to the Burmese majority. No? Merong report na a woman was ordered to do sit-ups for 30 minutes for not wearing a mask at a checkpoint. No? Siyempre sa atin, no? Nangyayari rin yan. No? Individuals who shared information, especially on social media about COVID, were arrested and charged under laws that penalized fake news. No? The pandemic has led also to an increase in discrimination, stigmatization, and harassment of religious and belief-based communities. Like in Thailand, no, there's a backlash against the small Muslim community in Thailand na sila daw yung nagdala ng COVID sa Thailand. So there's harassment, there's threats against the small Muslim minority in Thailand. No? So parliaments as a key body to provide oversight and guardians of human rights also face difficulties to carry out their jobs. No? For example, sa Malaysia, the Malaysian parliament was unable to sit for almost the first half of 2020. Ibig sabihin, hindi sila nagtawag ng session. So kung sa Pilipinas, very active, no? Ang daming kaganapan sa Kongreso. Sa Malaysia naman, baliktad. No? Hindi nagtawag yung Prime Minister ng session dahil daw sa pandemic. So hindi nila na-discuss, no, yung nangyayari sa kanilang bansa. Yung human rights violations, yung budget sana to respond to the pandemic. It should also be noted that the pandemic was at a time when government passed more oppressive laws. So meron tayong anti-terrorism law in the Philippines and the omnibus law in Indonesia. It is also a time where press freedom came increasingly under attack, including the closure of the broadcast network ABS-CBN and the guilty ruling of Rappler CEO Maria Ressa for cyber libel in the Philippines. COVID-19 has also revealed the failure and fragility of our current economic system that prioritized business interests over the well-being of people and the environment, deepened inequalities, and failed to protect the most vulnerable. For example, yung mga women, yung mga indigenous peoples, no, yung mga migrants, and yung mga refugees. So ang suggestions lang namin, no, going to the last portion of my talk, no, sa ASEAN Parliamentarians for Human Rights, no, we have some recommendations. No. ASEAN leaders need to ensure that their approaches and responses to address the pandemic contribute towards a truly people-centered ASEAN. This includes speaking out against human rights violations and the shrinking civic space, as well as all forms of discrimination. And we also have a suggestion for our parliamentarians, so yung mga kongresista natin at yung mga senator, no? And not just them siguro, but also our general public, no, when it comes to assessing our emergency laws, no? Kasi under international standards, no, when there is a crisis, for instance, a public health crisis, now while we consider that freedoms are absolute, no, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, these are all important. Pero pag may public health crisis, it is allowed that some of these freedoms can be limited or regulated. No? However, no, mayroon pa rin mga international standards na kinakailangan sundin. Unang-una sa lahat, no, yung emergency law, emergency measure law or emergency powers law has to be very clear in our definitions. No? Like for instance nga, yung terorista. No? Who is a terrorist? No? Or let's say fake news. What is fake news? It has to be clearly defined in law. No? Pangalawa, no, it is strictly necessary to combat the virus. So hindi ka naman pwede magpasa ng batas na sasabihin mo na ito ay kinakailangan because meron tayong pandemic. Pero actually, wala siyang kinalaman sa paglutas ng problema ng pandemya. Tulad nga sa Pilipinas, no? Yung anti-terrorism law, yung pinag-uusapan ngayon na palitan ng ating saligang batas. Third, standard is that measures adopted should be proportionate and the least intrusive possible. No? Ibig sabihin sa mga penalties, no? Din nga, sa Pilipinas, 30,000 people ang kinulong dahil lang lumabag sila dun sa lockdown regulations. Yun nga, nangyari sa Myanmar, no? Pinag-sit up ng 30 minutes, no? Isang babae dahil lang hindi siya nag-wear ng mask. Sa atin, sa Pilipinas, lumabas ka lang, especially during the early days of the lockdown, hindi ba, inaresto sila. 30,000, no? So, hindi appropriate yung punishment. No? So, hindi rin pwede kunyari na maglay ka na fake news. If you spread this information, then pwede kang ikulong ng 10 taon at magbayad ka ng 10 milyon as fine. No? So, you can pass legislation, but these have to be the standards. No? Measures adopted are not discriminatory and used to target particular groups or individuals, including minorities. And finally, no, emergency measures should also be strictly temporary and be reviewed regularly. Kasi nga sa Thailand, no, kahit no, iilan na lang yung cases nila sa COVID, hanggang ngayon, under pa rin sila sa state of emergency. Kaya nagpaprotesta na nga yung mga estudyante doon. No? Sa atin naman, no, we have the same situation in Mindanao. Until now, it is state of martial law, no, in Mindanao. No? Mukhang hindi na yata na-review because the law calls that it has to be reviewed regularly. No? Yun yung condition ng Congress, no, when it granted martial law in Mindanao, that there has to be an oversight review of how martial law is being implemented in Mindanao. Pero hindi nangyayari. So yun lang ang sharings ko. Siguro I'll just end by kasi si Attorney Chel, he ended with an inspirational message. Magbabago rin yan. Ako siguro dahil ang aking context is regional, no. I'm looking towards Thailand, no. Na dati pag sinayang mo Thailand, no, of course tourist place pero grabe military junta doon, no. But now the tide is changing. People are coming out led by the youth, no. Sila yung nagpo-protesta doon. It's also happening in Hong Kong. So while of course globally may trend nga na ang mga democracies ay kinikitil yung ating mga kalayaan, but there's also a pushback tulad nga ng sabi ng Atty. Chel. And I really also believe that change will eventually happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Kong Teddy. Thank you. Talagang dito pala sa atin sa Southeast Asia, no, daming issues. Yun nga, na-inspire nga tayo, nakita natin yung mga rally sa Thailand. At saka talagang kabataan ang namumuno dito sa mga rallies na ito. Parati nga po, nang sabi sa ating kasaysayan, ang mga kabataan talagang nangunguna. Ano po? Okay, so pupunta na po tayo sa ating question and answer. Meron po tayong mga tanong. na ating babasahin. Kay Kong Teddy at saka sa ating po mga speakers, kay Carlo at saka kay Dean Chel. So nakita po natin ang backslide ng human rights sa Pilipinas, Hong Kong, Thailand, ngayon pong pandemic. How can we tap the international community to defend and preserve human rights?
Ito nga, no, yung aming, actually before this, I came from a diplomatic briefing, no, ng APHR with the diplomatic community in the Philippines. So present lang namin yung report namin sa APHR on parliamentarians who are being harassed and threatened, kinukulong. So kasama na dyan si Senator Laila, kasama na dyan yung Future Forward Party sa Thailand na bigla na lang dinisolve, no, ng Thai government. Because I think it's important na magsanib puwersa, no? Lahat ng, not just the parliamentarians, but also civil society, regionally, and work hand in hand with the diplomatic community. That's one of the tactics that we are doing. We're talking to the diplomatic community in Thailand, in Malaysia, in the Philippines, para pinipresent namin na this is what's happening in our governments. And it's a trend region-wide. No? So it's important that we support our parliamentarians. Pag sinabi kong kasi sa mundo ang tawag sa mga kongresista parliamentarians, you know. So let's support parliamentarians who advocate human rights and democratic values, and they are many in Southeast Asia. No? And at the same time, kinakailangan rin talaga na we work together with civil society organizations, the media, you know, and the general public as a whole. Because ang kalaban natin actually in Southeast Asia is, ako ito yung analysis ko no? Ang pinipresent kasi na model in Southeast Asia na sinusunod ng mga dictators dito sa Southeast Asia ay yung Chinese model. Because ASEAN, actually, it's a growing economic bloc. No? Yumayaman ang mga Southeast Asian countries. And the Chinese model says that yumaman ka, hindi mo naman masyadong kinakailangan ng human rights and freedoms. Yun yung sinusunod ni Hun Sen, yun ang gusto ni Duterte, yun ang sinusunod ni Prime Minister ng Thailand, no? So yun ang dapat nating labanan. We have to also, I guess, educate our public, no? How important democracy is, not just for ourselves but also for the economy. No? Kasi yun yun yung model na yumaman ang ating bansa, hindi na natin kinakailangan ng demokrasya, no? Human rights.
Thank you, Kong Teddy. Baka meron pong gustong idagdag si Dean Chel at si Carlo.
Yes, hi Kong Teddy. Agree ako kay Kong Teddy. We have a lot of friends outside of the country. Marami talagang concerned sa nangyayari sa atin at gustong tumulong. At kahit na kinukunwari ng pamahalaan na hindi daw tumatalab yung mga sinasabi ng United Nations at yung mga nanggagaling sa labas ng bansa, ang totoo niyan, nararamdaman nila yon. And they are sensitive to the international community and the opinions of the people in the United Nations. Kaya ako, ang payo ko ay tuloy-tuloy lang. Just keep on bringing our issues up. Salamat kay Content for all the work you're doing in that respect. And there are many others who are also involved in that. Lalo na sa human rights community. Every year kasi nagkakaroon ng Universal Periodic Review sa Human Rights Council. Kaya lahat ng mga NGO dito ay nagsasubmit ng mga report. And whenever may mga kakaibang mga insidente, ay kami sa FLAG and other groups also inform our counterparts in the UN and in other countries. Lang.
Thank you, Dean Chel. Carlo, may dadagdag ka?
For me naman, kasi ang pinaka-importante dito talaga is yung participation ng mga communities, especially the youth. Ngayon talaga ay tech-savvy tayong mga kabataan. At mas doon, what we need, the most important thing for us is defending human rights is to document it. We have the tools, we have our cell phones, we have our laptops. We can document these violations and we can send them to authorities like the Commission on Human Rights or to NGOs na para matulungan din sila makompile itong mga violations ng human rights natin. Bukod sa pagpo-post natin sa social media, no, there are proper ways in dealing with this, and there are a lot of civil society organizations and the Commission on Human Rights that can help us i-move forward yung mga complaints natin.
Thank you, Carlo. Next question natin. Lalo na sa incumbent kay Carlo. Is it impossible to insert provisions protecting our human rights in upcoming laws related to the COVID-19 pandemic? Given that Congress is full of allies of the President, is it possible to enact pro-human rights laws? Like, kunwari itong bayanihan mo, di ba? Bakit merong mga, mga parang alanganin na provisions doon? Ano bang ginawa ninyo paraan para ma-assert din natin ang human rights doon sa mga laws na ito?
Well, for one is yun nga medyo mahaba-haba talagang negosasyon yan. At God, this is recorded. But, hirapan ako. Pero ang ano doon is, una nasa constitution naman siya 'di ba? And yung constitution is, yun talaga yung pangunahing batas natin. At yun yung kailangang sundin. At yun yung basihan ng lahat ng batas na ginagawa namin sa Kongreso. So kung may lalabag man doon na mga kung may lalabag man na legislation sa constitution, dapat hindi na dapat yun sinusunod, katulad ng anti-terror bill na ikaw ang may burden na mag-prove na hindi ka terorista pag binagbintangan kang terorista. Mali yun, lalo na sa sa proseso ng batas. Hindi dapat ganun yung nangyayari. So, yun nga, kasama namin, di ba, nandun tayo ng Atty. Chel, di ba, nung sa Supreme Court, nung nag-file tayo ng ating petition. So, isa yun sa mga akbang. Pero, for insertions talaga, ang insertions, ito budget. Okay. If you want provisions talaga, pwede yun. Pwede yung ilagay sa isang batas, sa isang legislation. Ang ano lang talaga is, how should I say this? Siguro the best thing is kung yung batas is walang masyadong atensyon. 'Di ba? Kung walang masyadong atensyon, if nobody is paying attention to sa isang batas, minsan nailulusot natin siya ng walang contestation, lalo na sa mga mga powers at be.
Kailangan maging vigilant, Kong Teddy, ayan, Kong Teddy, dating congressman, sir.
Naiintindihan ko yung sabihin ni Carlo. Ako, let me, in answering that question, let me siguro get a page from the storybook of Senator Frank Drilon, because Frank Drilon has been vilified by some liberals for his support to the anti-terrorism act. Support in the sense na bumoto kasi siya yes with reservations. Pero actually, initially naman talaga ang position ni Senator Frank, he was against the anti-terrorism act. So siya yung nagka-question sa floor because he was the Senate minority floor leader. But because of the gravitas, kasi Frank Drilon yan, so sige, nag-negotiate sila. Sige, supportahan mo na itong anti-terrorism. Ano yung pwede mong maipasok doon? So yun yung mga pinasok niya. Although we still fundamentally oppose the anti-terrorism act, pero may mga pinasok siya which would at least respect a certain semblance of the rule of law and also the rights of those who are charged, or who are branded as terrorists. But yun nga, it takes some sacrifice because eventually he had to vote yes with reservation. So hindi ko alam sa Congress kung merong gustong gumawa nun. Because I've seen it happen, na yung opposition, I don't know, I think Edsel Lagman for one time also would do that. Sige, fundamentally they oppose it, pero sige, dahil nakakapagpasok ka, nakakapag-insert ka ng some provisions, insert some provisions, Ang condition lang is eventually you have to vote yes to that bill. And human rights naman, dapat talagang ma-insert yan. Kasi sabi nga ni Carlo, that's universal. It's in our constitution. So just make sure na yung mga provisions doon sa Bayanihan Act would not violate human rights. And that's where siguro the minority, the opposition can come in and make sure that these provisions would not violate human rights. And yun,
Thank
by
you.
experience.
Thank you. Yes, pag may dadagdag si Carla.
Ko lang, syempre 'di ba, with Senator Drilon, para kasi kung nag-insert siya ng mga provisions is technically naging author na rin siya ng bill. 'Di ba? And kung naging author ka ng bill na yon at nag-vote ka ng no after dun sa mga negotiation na yon, parang may politics yun may internal politics yun sa within legislation sa House or sa Senate. Na medyo parang nakikita na mahirap ka ng kausap. At mahirapan na rin makipag-negotiate sa'yo if you're going back on your word.
Thank you. Din Chel, may dadagdag po kayo? Okay, thank you. Next question natin. Yung tanong ko sa iyo kanina din, Chel, yung mga inuli illegal arrests na ito, pwede ba tayong magkasuhan yung mga erring policemen?
Pwede yan. Ito lang ang nagiging problema natin. This applies to all kinds of human rights violations. And not just during the pandemic, pati na rin bago nangyari ito. Dahil nasa ilalim tayo ng isang, kumbaga we are under a climate of fear and violence. Marami na ako nakausap na pamilya, halimbawa ng naging biktima ng EJK, talagang gusto nila ng hustisya. Kaya lang, they have this reluctance to file cases kasi ang tanong nila sa akin ay, Attorney, paano yan pag magsampa tayo ng kaso ngayon? Baka naman balikan kami. Paano yung iba kong mga anak, yung pamilya ko? Baka maging biktima din sila ng EJK. At ako naman, wala akong maibibigay na garantiya sa kanila na hindi mangyayari yon. Ang parati kong sinasabi sa kanila ay ayusin muna natin, buuin natin ang ebidensya. I-document natin ng kompleto yung pangyayari, lahat ng mga testigo, kunan na natin ng affidavit, yung kung meron CCTV camera, kung meron kahit anong mga evidence, photographs, kolektahin na natin lahat yon. At pagdating ng mas magandang panahon ay pwede na tayo magsampa ng kaso. Mahaba-haba naman ang prescriptive period sa mga kasong ganyan so that we don't need to file immediately. Ngayon, yung isa pa kasing pwedeng available na option dyan ay dalhin muna yung kaso sa United Nations. May Human Rights Committee dyan, may Human Rights Council, may mga special rapporteur. At para naman kahit papano ay ngayon pa lang may dokumento na natin yung pangyayari and we can already bring it out internationally. The same applies to yung mga naging biktima ng unlawful arrest. Pero ito, sasabihin ko sa inyo yung isa namin kliyente na nung una talagang marami siyang misgiving na ayaw niya mag-file, ganyan-ganyan. Mismo siya na ang tumawag sa amin ng isang linggo. Sabi niya, Attorney, handa na ako. Gusto ko na magsampa ng kaso doon sa pagkahuli sa akin na walang warrant. So, sa mga kliyenteng ganun, sure. Hinahanda na nga namin yung complaint doon. It really all depends on the situation. But these remedies are available even now. Thank you.
Thank you. May gusto po kayong idagdag doon? Sinabi ni Dean Chel. Kung wala na po, next question tayo. Baka alam ninyo, Attorney Chel, kung sa HR, di ba, marami Human Rights Commission, marami ring naisampa dito. Would you know kung if they are acting on it, kung anong estado ng mga, kasi sabi, ang dami daw mga naisampa doon, no?
Alam ko, tuloy-tuloy ang trabaho ng Commission on Human Rights sa mga insidenteng na ilalapit sa kanila. As far as I know, some of these cases have already been brought to the proper prosecuting authorities. Hindi ko lang alam yung mismong status ng mga kaso kung ito ba ay naisampa na sa korte o hindi pa. But what I can assure is that the CHR has been working very hard. Ang issue kasi ng CHR ay issue ng resources. Dahil siyempre nasa pandemya tayo, number one, hirap silang lumabas. Kung nakakalabas man, hindi siya buong complement ng mga staff o mga investigators. And of course, they have to also make sure that they take the necessary precautions to avoid getting infected, aside from the typical risks involved in investigating human rights cases. Actually, sila pa yung isang frontliner na dapat natin bigyan ng recognition dahil they really go out of their way despite the risks to investigate and pursue cases of human rights violations.
Okay, thank you, Dean Chel. Next question po natin. Ito, do you think it's time to infuse human rights in the curriculum of the PNP and AFP sa mga kanilang PNP Academy o PMA, I should say. PMA, sa mga tinuturo daw natin sa ating mga sundalo.
Mauna na akong sagutin yan, if kung Ted and Carlo don't mind. Dati kasi nandyan na yan. In fact, yung mga NGOs tulad ng FLAG ay kuminsan kinukumbida pa nga na kami ang magbigay ng training sa kanila. Bago pumasok itong administrasyon, talagang very vigorous yung pag-infuse ng human rights both in the PNP and the AFP. Pareho silang may human rights office, very active ang human rights office noon. Ito lang, simula noong 2016 hanggang ngayon, hindi na namin nakakausap yung mga yon. At as far as I know, wala na mga training na nangyayari. Ang hindi ko alam to what extent ito ay kasama sa curriculum ng PNP Academy at saka ng Philippine Military Academy. I know that it should be part of their curriculum. Hindi ko lang, lately, wala lang akong information kung ito pa itinuturo pa. Dapat lang isama nila yan.
Thank you. Yes, Carlo, please.
Second ko lang din yung kay Atty. Chel na we were doing that before 2016 din eh. When I was working with Balay Rehabilitation Center noon, we were training jail personnel sa BJMP and we have close relations with the PNP and AFP ng pag-develop ng curriculum talaga for pag-enrich ng human rights, lalong-lalo na sa pag-perform ng kanilang duties. Problem is, nung pagkatapos ng 2016 talaga, it just went nagbago eh. And we were hoping nga hanggang pati buong civil service dapat merong human rights education eh. Pero with the current political climate ngayon, parang medyo mahirap i-penetrate yung ganong value, yung ganong agenda, lalo-lalo na sa government service natin. And most especially sa security sector na sila dapat yung nagpo-protect ng human rights ng citizens.
Thank you. Kung Teddy, may dadagdag po kayo?
Yeah, sasang-ayunan ko lang yung sinabi nila Atty. Chel sa ni Carlo. Meron naman human rights program ang AFP at saka ang Philippine National Police. Naalala ko nga nung I was chair of the Committee on Indigenous Peoples. Laging sinasabi ng AFP participants dun sa aming mga congressional hearings na meron silang bawat kampo may human rights office. May nakausap ako, Lady General, she headed the Human Rights Division of the Philippine National Police. Meron pa nga sila yung internal affairs na talagang pag may pinatay, lalo na kung may mga circumstances, no, na suspicious circumstances, meron talaga investigation. Unfortunately, tulad nga ng sabi ni Chel at ni Carlo, I think right now kasi ang usaping human rights masyado siya naging political. Kasi ako, pag kinakausap ko yung mga kababayan ko, alam niyo mga Cordilleras, ang daming mga pulis dyan. Mga kaibigan ko yan. Pag binanggit mo na yung human rights, ano na sila kasi dilawang ka ganyan at tutol ka kay Duterte. But yun nga, lagi kong binabalikan na hindi, yun, sinasabi naman natin palagi na human rights is universal. Lahat may karapatang pantao, pati pulis may karapatang pantao ka. Nakakapagsalita ka, nakapasok ka sa kapulisan dahil nga under height yung mga Cordillerans. Dahil meron ka pa ring right na maging pulis because pinaglaban natin yan sa Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act. No, na may mga exemptions, no, yung mga katutubo dahil pandak sila. But yun nga, I guess that's a challenge for all of us to educate our people about what human rights really are. No? Na hindi lang siya civil and political rights. No? Lahat ng aspeto ng ating buhay, kinakailangan meron tayong paggalang sa ating mga karapatang pantao.
Oo. Yun nga po yung isang tanong din, Kong Teddy. Paano po natin ipaiintindi sa mga nasa laylayan yung kahalagahan ng karapatang pantao?
You know, everyday naman kasi, especially for those in the laylayan, di ba? Everything that they experience, no, yung gutom, the right to food, di ba? Sama yan, no? Yung kawalan ng trabaho, no? Yung kawalan ng educational opportunities, lahat ng mga nararanasan ng mga laylayan talks about essentially kung pag-aaralan natin karapatang pantao. Kaya when we talk about yung human rights sa indigenous peoples, no, doon mismo sa pagkatao nila, the right to an identity. Marami mga katutubo hindi man lang registered. So pinag-alaban namin yung inyong karapatan sa inyong kultura, no? So madali sanang pag-usapan 'yon eh. But I think there was one proposal na let's start doon sa education, no, sa ating educational system. Hindi ko na kasi syempre kami nung nag-aral tayo sa high school, college, wala naman masyado pinag-usapan na human rights, no. So I don't know how nag-proceed yung balak noon na i-include talaga ang human rights topics, no, sa ating DepEd curriculum because it really starts from there. Ngayon nga, ang tingin ng tao, human rights is ay kampi ka sa mga kriminal, kampi ka sa kasi because of the misinformation, no, because of the politicization of the human rights, no, of human rights issues. Yun ang tingin ng tao. So I think para maalis yun, we really have to, no, incorporate these topics into our curriculum.
Opo. Thank you. Meron po kayo idadagdag? Next question na tayo. Na ikwento kanina ni Dean Chel, sabi niya, isang issue din daw yung sa education. Yan, yung right to education. 'Di ba? Dahil nga dito sa ating pandemic, tapos online lahat, tapos nahihirapan lahat. So meron kang gustong ikwento about that, Dinchel, kanina?
Well, ako nagtuturo ngayon. Medyo pati ang mga guro na mahirap mag-adjust sa online learning. Medyo maswerte lang ako dahil sa Lasal ako nagtuturo. So you would think na hindi magkaka-issue ang mga estudyante ko sa law school pagdating sa online. Pero nung minsan may klase ako, may break kami, kausap ko sila through Zoom. At sabi ko, ano ba ikwento niyo sa akin? Ano ba nangyayari sa inyo? Kumusta na kayo dyan? Paano yung experience niyo under online learning? At ang dami pala nilang issue. Sabi sa akin ng isang estudyante, naku din, akala ng mga guro siguro wala kaming ginagawa sa bahay kasi sobra-sobra yung binibigay nilang work sa amin. Ang daming assignment. Nakakalimutan nila na may iba pang subject kami, may iba pa kami mga klase. Sabi naman ng iba, nakaka-stress kasi hindi nila makontrol yung signal ng Wi-Fi. Hindi nila malaman kung mahina o malakas ang Wi-Fi dun sa oras ng klase. Pag sila ay pinapatawag for recitation at hindi marinig ng teacher, nasa-stress sila na baka naman ibabagsak sila ng teacher. At hindi lang, it's not just yung issues about the access to Wi-Fi, I think. Ang dami kasing anxiety ngayon eh. lalo na pagdating sa issues ng nagkasakit yung kapatid ko, yung nanay ko, o na-COVID palalo. So this combination of being in a lockdown together with the issues of anxiety, and then you have now the additional stress caused by online learning, or sabihin na lang natin yung kahit yung gustong gawin o yung gagawin, yung ginagawa daw ng DepEd na modular learning, doon naman ang issue ay aabot ba talaga yung mga material na yan sa mga estudyante, lalo na sa mga malalayong lugar. Paano nila ibabalik pagka let's say na natanggap naman nila at nagawa naman nila yung mga lesson, paano ngayon yung pagbalik nila sa DepEd? And all of these issues, I think, could have been addressed by better planning. Ngayon na nandiyan na yan, I think that DepEd has to be more responsive and really has to put their ear to the ground to make sure that lahat ng mga nakita nilang problema ay ayusin nila agad. Kaya I really empathize with our students and teachers because of the adjustments we all have to make.
Okay, thank you. Talagang human right din yung merong work and life balance din siguro, din pagdating sa bahay, kahit nasa bahay, kailangan may balance pa rin. So ano po ang opinion ninyo dito sa nakaraang red tagging naman? Balik tayo sa violations, yung pagre-red tag, tsaka itong kay Lisa Soberano, and baka meron kayong opinion about this.
Ay nako, grabe yung red tagging na yan. Kung titingnan natin yung ating history kasi, matagal nang ginagawa yan eh. Noong panahon pa nila Claro M. Recto, nila Jose P. Laurel noong 1950s, sila ay nire-red tag mismo ng pamahalaan. Yung dating, ng panahon na yon, yung Secretary of Justice ay si Oscar Castelo. Siya na mismo yung nagsasabi na mga ito ay mga komunista, etc., etc. And yet, alam naman natin na talagang mga respected na mga statesmen sila. Pati si dating Senator Lorenzo Tañada, yung lolo ni Erin, na red tag din yan. At kaya hindi ito panibagong practice ng pamahalaan. Ang nakakalungkot lang ay akala ko tapos na yan. Kasi after EDSA, di ba, nagkaroon na tayo ng magandang konstitusyon, nandiyan na kinikilala yung human rights, sa may Commission on Human Rights na tayo, and one would have thought that this whole derogatory name calling would have been finished already. Ang issue rin kasi ay ito ay tingin ko naging mainit na topic ito dahil sa Anti-Terror Act. Kasi nga nung bago pa lang, nung bill pa lang yan, meron mga ibang nasa militar natin na nagsasabi na yung dapat gagamitin itong anti-terror law dun sa mga sinasabi nilang kaliwa o yung mga members of the Communist Party. And to me, it's talagang mali. They should not be allowed to red tag anybody. Kung meron silang ebidensya na yung isa ay may naglalabag sa ating mga batas, disapahan nila ng kaso. Wag mo nang ilabas sa media yan. File the case. Kaya mabuti naman at marami na rin nagsasalita kahit mga nasa pamahalaan na sila na mismo ay nagsabi na hindi na dapat gawin ito. I hope that those who are red tagging will listen. And at the same time, ito ay na-tweet ko na rin ito, kung kayo ay naging biktima ng red tagging, marami tayong magagawa para mag-push back dyan. You can file cases locally with the Commission on Human Rights, with the Office of the Ombudsman, with the PNP, with the AFP. You can go to the United Nations. Marami mga ahensya din dyan at mga rapporteur na pwedeng puntahan. At kami sa FLAG at yung ibang mga NGO lawyers groups ay willing tumulong sa inyo. Kontakin niyo lang kami.
Thank you. May idadagdag po kayo doon? Ang Teddy tsaka si Carlo.
Pero in brief lang, parang kasi I'm looking at it in a silver lining, with a silver lining. Ano ba yung positive doon? No? Kasi kadalasan ng mga rinired tag ay mga politiko, particularly yung nasa opposition, mga aktivista, mga NGO workers, mga pesante. Pero ngayon, first time celebrities nare-red tag na rin. So I think maybe we can capitalize on the consequence of that red tagging nila Angel, nila Liza, no, nila Catriona. Na ngayon pati mga celebrities nagsasalita na. Because hindi lang naman yung issue ng red tagging ang pinag-usapan dito, the issue on women's rights, no. Na pag ikaw ay nagsalita for women's rights, binansagan ka ng komunista, yun ang sinasabi nila, or red tag ka na. So ngayon, let's encourage the celebrities to speak out, no? Kasi whether we like it or not, mga influencers ang mga to no? Itong mga celebrities. So now they're speaking and saying that we're doing this because we believe in women's rights. I guess that's also how we go about in getting people to support human rights advocacy. Kasi nga nagiging politika So if we have more and more non-politicians o non-politica speaking about human rights, no, whether it's women's rights or indigenous people's rights o ano man, then siguro mas makakatulong ating mga kababayan.
Oo. Thank you. Carlo, may dadagdag ka? Ito po, recently maraming mga fake accounts sa Facebook. Ano po ang thoughts ninyo or suggestions para sa mga taong ginagawa ng fake accounts? Kasama ba yan sa... dapat makita talaga kung talagang related nga doon sa meron silang meron silang ibang purpose doon sa paggawa ng fake accounts na yun, tapos gumawa, di ba? Kasi yun na nga po, medyo nakikita na pag ginawa ka ng fake accounts, pwedeng manggaling sa'yo at pwede kang hulihin pag nagsalita ka ng labag sa gobyerno. Opo, ano ang thoughts po ninyo dito?
Well, ang advice ko lang sa mga naging biktima niyan ay i-report nyo agad sa Facebook. Mukha naman proactive ang Facebook ngayon at mabuti naman medyo nagigising na ang Facebook pagdating sa issue na yan. May, actually every day there is an ongoing war on the internet between ito mga trolls, yung mga paid na na gumagawa ng mga ganyan, and those who genuinely want to express their opinion. At yung sa simula pa lang nitong administrasyon, napansin natin na pag ikaw ay nagsalita noon nung early part na itong ng 2016, agad-agad, dadagsa ang mga troll sa iyo, bashing, lahat-lahat. Pero dahil marami nang nagsasalita ngayon at na marami na rin ang nagpo-push back, ay hindi nag-aano ngayon. It's not as bad as it was before. So we have to keep on fighting for that democratic space, both on the internet and outside in the streets.
Yeah. Thank you din, Chel. Meron po? Yes, Carla, please.
And for me, ako, ang inaano namin dyan is mas dapat maging thoughtful ka, maging aware ka dun sa mga pinopost mo sa social media. And siguro, para maiwasan na din yon is ano mo din yung privacy settings ng yung mga posts, no, na parang unless you're a public figure, unless you're an influencer, madali ka i-verify na ibang tao. But if you're someone who is, relatively unknown to social media, you have to fix your privacy settings in a way na hindi basta-basta mananakaw yung pictures mo or hindi ka basta-basta mako-quote. And may mga ganong settings din naman yung Facebook and Twitter na para hindi ka ma-misquote.
Okay, thank you.
Unless na lang talaga may deliberate attempt na i-ano ka. Pero for I think for tawag dito, for yung mass-produced na fake accounts is I think hindi yun basta-basta magagawa lalo na pag sa trolling.
Okay, thank you. Oo. Ito po, Chief Justice Peralta said they tried their best about sa kaso ni Baby River. Do you think enough ang ginawa ng Supreme Court or they simply ignored the case?
I'm not familiar
Court,
with,
oo.
hindi ko kabisado gaano yung actual legal side niyan dahil hindi naman ako involved dun sa case. Ang masasabi ko lang dyan ay we have always had a problem with delayed justice in the country. That matagal na issue yan. Mayroon akong nabasang isang desisyon nung isang araw lang na 22 years siya nasampahan ng kaso, halos more than 20 years ata siyang nakulong. Nung umabot yung appeal niya sa Supreme Court, sabi ng Supreme Court ay hindi naman pala dapat siya nasampahan ng kaso.
Oh no.
Imagine, halos more than half ng buhay niya ay nasayang lang dahil dun sa sobrang tagal ng paglitis ng kaso. Bakit ganun ang sitwasyon? Kasi kulang na kulang tayo ng judge at ng prosecutor. 20% ng mga sala natin, yung mga trial courts natin, walang judge. More than 30% ng mga prosecutor positions sa DOJ ay bakante rin. Kaya isipin niyo kung ang justice system natin ay isang ospital, kulang ka ng doktor, kulang ka ng nurse, talagang walang mangyayari dyan. Tatagal at maraming mamamatay na pasyente dahil hindi sila mabibigyan ng tamang aksyon. And that is an issue that our government should be addressing. Pero itong problema, wala man lang sa kanilang national agenda itong issue ng napakabulok na sistema ng hustisya sa atin. That should be part, in fact, to me, it should be one of the top priorities after dealing with the pandemic. Ang dapat next priority dyan, yung issue ng pagkukulang ng hustisya sa atin. Dahil never natin ma-address yung issue ng corruption, yung issue ng impunity, yung pagkawala ng accountability kung hindi maayos ang ating justice system.
Opo. Thank you, Attorney Chel. Tama nga yun. Tama at yung bottleneck sa justice system natin, ang tagal. Kawawa naman po yung 20 years na kulong. O kaya ay ikukulong ka na illegally tapos gusto mong sampahan din kaya lang sa sobrang tagal ng justice system maunahan ka pa bago magkaroon ng resolution. Opo. May nagtanong po tungkol doon sa anti-terrorism law kasi nga human rights din yung pinag-uusapan natin. Sa tingin niyo po ba madedeklara daw ba ng Supreme Court ito na unconstitutional?
Sana. Mahirap sabihin kung anong gagawin ng ating Korte Suprema dyan. But I would say I'm cautiously optimistic that at least some parts of the law will be nullified. Kasi may mga obvious naman dyan sa batas na yan na kinukuha niya yung kapangyarihan ng mga korte at ibinibigay sa Anti-Terror Council. Halimbawa, yung provision doon na ang pwedeng mag-authorize ng 24 na araw ng detention ay ang ATC. Traditionally, function ng court talaga yan. Pangalawa, yung sinasabi nilang power to designate na ibinigay din sa Anti-Terror Council na pagka ikaw ay na-designate bilang isang terorista, gagalaw ng AMLA, pwede na i-freeze ang assets nila, pwede magkaroon ng surveillance, so mag-apply sila ng court-authorized surveillance, and even arrest and prosecution. These are things that, to me, I'm hoping that the Supreme Court will really act on immediately. Yung pangatlong issue na ito talaga ang dinadala namin issue sa Supreme Court, yung issue ng freedom of speech. Dahil yung dati natin terror law, yung Human Security Act, dadalawa lang ang krimen noon terrorism and conspiracy to commit terrorism. Ngayon sa ilalim nitong bagong anti-terror law, 9 na ang bagong crime. Nandiyan pa rin ang terrorism, may conspiracy pa rin, pero ngayon may inciting to terrorism na para siyang inciting to sedition na speech crime. Magsalita ka lang, pwede ka nang hulihin at kasuhan ng inciting to terrorism. Nandyan din yung facilitating terrorism and providing material support. Na yun ang nakakatakot na mga provision ng anti-terror law. Dahil let's say, meron kayong, marami ngayon mga groups that are working on the ground. May mga tumutulong sa mga IP, may mga tumutulong sa mga magsasaka, sa kawimenan, sa iba't ibang mga sektor ng ating lipunan. Pag yun ay na-designate na quote-unquote terrorist organization at kayo naman ay nagbibigay ng tulong doon sa mga NGO na yun, ay pwede ka nang makasuhan ngayon ng providing material support to a terrorist organization. So all of these are very concerning, and I really hope that the Supreme Court will act quickly and act positively on the petitions.
Okay. May gusto po kayo idagdag? Okay na po. So, itong pandemic po, maraming nailabas nga ng mga ganitong mga issues. At mabuti na lamang po nandito ang FLAG, ang Human Rights Commission at iba't ibang mga human rights defenders na tumutulong. At gusto ko lang pong i-synthesize po yung ating mga napag-usapan kanina. Sa kaso po ni Kongkit tsaka nila Carlo na sila ay incumbent, importante po na i-involve nila yung communities. Involve po nila at i-consult nang sa ganon ay magkaroon din ng sense of ownership yung community sa kanilang ginagalawan para marinig din yung boses nila and they will be able to come up with the best solutions para dito sa mga problema. Kaya yun ang isang tamang approach po pag kayo ay incumbent para dito sa mga kaso po, lalo na sa mga human rights violations. Importante din, sabi nga ninyong lahat, ng ating tatlong speakers, na to educate the people. Kailangan matutunan nila, ma-empower sila para maging active agents to prevent itong mga transgressions, di ba? So as active agents, kaya nilang protektahan din yung sarili nila to empower them. And si Chel nagsabi siya, paano ba protektahan ng human rights? Sabi niya, push back, suportahan natin yung mga naninindigan at tumatayo. I-document natin. Number 2, i-document daw natin. Number 3, i-report natin sa CHR, sa PNP, sa AFP, sa United Nations, o sa mga organizations na tumutulong kagaya ng FLAG. Di po ba? Para nang sa ganon, lalong lumakas po yung loob nitong mga taong na naaapi dahil nakaka-curtail yung kanilang human rights. Nabanggit din po ni Kong Teddy kanina na dito sa atin sa Southeast Asia, pinalalakas natin yung ating democracy pero parang dahil dito sa pandemic, medyo nag-step backward, no? Ang ating democracy dahil nga na yung human rights violations na na-record. At paano ba yan? Nagiging model naman natin yung China model. sana dahil nga capitalist at communist sila pero merong mga paraan na mas lalo tayong lalakas yung demokrasya basta i-obserbahan natin sa Southeast Asia. Dapat meron. Kaya kailangan palakasin yung Southeast Asia para magtulungan, para lalong magkaroon ng mentoring at i-guide yung isa't isa para lalong lumakas yung democracy natin sa Southeast Asia. At pag mas malakas ang democracy, yun ang formula Ang pinaka-formula kasi for democracy yung alagaan din yung human rights natin. Opo. So, yan po. Ito po ang sa 8th episode ng ating doses of good governance at gusto ko ulit pong magpasalamat sa ating mga speakers. Andito po ang representative ulit ni Congressman Kit Belmonte, si Lian Carlo Luis Ipac. Carlo, thank you very much. Ang ating pong woke lolo at parati pong nasa webinar at nasa iba't ibang social media dialogues ngayon. Ang very in demand po ang ating si Dean Chel Diokno. Maraming salamat po sa inyong oras. At syempre, ang tumataguyod po sa indigenous peoples, lalo na sa human rights and all concerns on indigenous peoples, former Congressman Teddy Baguilat. Maraming salamat po. Kailian, pareho ko pong Ilocano si Kong Teddy. Opo. So, maraming salamat po sa lahat ng mga nakinig at sa lahat po ng mga dumalo, lalong-lalo na po sa Philippine Daily Inquirer, sa inquirer.net, sa Inquirer Mobile, at sa Inquirer Foundation. Maraming salamat po sa ating Kaya Natin Movement for Good Governance and Ethical Leadership. Maraming salamat sa mga kay Camille at saka kay Kent po dito sa inyo. Maraming salamat po at dito po nagtatapos ang ating 8th episode ng Doses for Good Governance. Banggitin ko po na merong 9th episode kasi 12 episodes po ito. Yung topic po sa susunod ay how youth's active discourse on politics and governance in social media is crucial to today's time. So yan po yung next topic natin. So maraming salamat po at magandang gabi po sa ating lahat. Thank you. Thank you po sa inyo.
Doses of Good Governance. Kaya Natin Movement's webinar series is in partnership with the Philippine Daily Inquirer, the Inquirer Foundation, and Inquirer.net.